One of Jonathan Bowden's more consistent positions across his life was his aversion to Christianity. And whether this aversion was psychological or philosophical has often been up for debate. It's said that perhaps the similarities between Christianity and liberalism led him to reject Christianity's liberal tendencies, particularly after the madness and death of his mother and the reaction after that. I think it's the Black Gnosis interview in which he addresses the fact that he turned to the right metaphysically and politically because he was so disappointed with the half-believed, partly false concern that people had for him, and the justifications and the ways that they rationalised this tragedy. And in a way, the Christian ideal to Bowden was in a similar sort of maudlin sentimentality as the liberal view. And when he was very young, allegedly, of course, you can't trust Bowden because Bowden is a notorious liar. But if we are to trust Bowden, that he read the complete works of Nietzsche when he was 12 or 13 or something like that. And from that, he developed an anti-Christianity. I think there's something that goes beyond Nietzsche and something that is more rooted into his pagan ideals, which is, okay, yes, Christianity has a certain it has a certain closeness to liberalism, and there's a certain proximity between modern Christianity and liberal ideology, which he despised so much. But I think more deeper than that, Bowden, being someone of quite high IQ, eccentric as he was in many ways a kind of materialist. But Bowden's materialism was very different to the everyday materialist, particularly of a liberal. And to understand that more, it's better to go into sort of philosophy of mind. Bowden always said that he respected the views of Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics, and particularly of Heraclitus, this idea of what you could call dynamic monism. And this concept that for him energy, he was never explicit about this, but the idea that perhaps energy has an ontology in itself, which philosophers of science kind of not really sure about, and we kind of put energy in as a accounting, as a kind of physical accounting, as a placeholder. We're not necessarily talking about a substance. But Bowden, in a way, believes that all matter and all of action and all of reality, including ideals, are ultimately reducible to a physical substrate. And of course, he may accept a degree of emergence from that and say that from the flux and conflict of energy and the relative distributions of energy, that through that difference, again, that radical difference which comes into his inegalitarianism, it's only through that difference and that differential of energy that there's any possibility of change, and there's any possibility then of emergent mental states come out of that. Now, why I think he holds this view is because, like so many on the right, he can't accept the kind of eliminativism or the naive form of reductionism of the scientists. And what I mean by that is that on the metaphysically conservative aspect, there is a belief in reality being constituted of objects, right? Of actually existing objects that perhaps even derive their objecthood from some prior form. And you'll often find this kind of Platonism on the right of people that believe that there's this absolute ideal of an object, and all the objects reflect that. on the other side, on the kind of the Redditor, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Hitch Slap type attitude, you're going to get the other side where everything can be reduced, that there are no objects in the world, objects don't exist, that every single object can be immediately reducible to its constituent parts. Now, obviously, the problem that comes out of this, as the modern kind of neo-Heideggerian philosopher Graham Harman understands, is that you get into a position of overmining, right, and undermining, where you're actually asserting the existence of these objects even in the same breath as you're attempting to eliminate them. So, for instance, the human object, right, the human subject as object. Is that an object that exists? Well, perhaps a materialist, a limitivist might say that the human experience is simply reducible to a network or an emergent pattern of individual organs or individual processes, and even those organs can be broken down. And so there is no human object. There's no chair object, there's no telephone object, because all of these objects can simply be reduced to their constituent parts. Well, obviously the problem that emerges from that is that when that reduction takes place, ultimately there has to be something that stops it. So there has to be something that you would describe as unsupervenient, right? That you can say that mental states perhaps supervene on or depend upon the physical states, that you can't have an idea without a mind, right? And you can't have a mind without a brain. So you have to have a thinker in order to have a thought. They can't exist independently. So fine. And you can say the same thing about objects and say that, the human object couldn't exist unless that objectivity supervened upon all of the constituent components of the human. But the problem with that is that, as Harman points out, and many others have pointed out in response to these hitch-slap Redditors that want to destroy all objectivity, they want to say that everything is reducible and abstract, and so relativistic and just made up on the fly, that what we define as the human object is just consensus building. Of course, a consensus of what? Of systems interacting, right? But the system isn't classified as an object. So you see again with these problems where, as you eliminate the human and say, okay, well, the human object is an abstract concept that only exists in a social relation, that supervenes upon the brain, and that supervenes upon neurons, that supervenes upon atoms, and the atoms supervene upon the constituent elemental particles, etc., etc. But if you attempt to reduce in an atomistic way, that many of these people do, of course, they lionize. Hitchens himself, I think it was in Hitch 22, I can't exactly remember, but he wrote that Lucretius was one of his favourite writers. And ironically, Lucretius was also one of Karl Marx's favourite writers, because Lucretius and Epicurus were defending a purely materialist and atomistic, ultimately, view of the world, where all matter and all objects are reducible to individual constituent atoms that were indivisible, and that all of the change in life is a product of a random swerve, right? And this was a part of the theory that this is not necessarily respected now, because of this fact. But even at the time, Cicero and the Stoics mocked Lucretius and the atomists, as you want to call them, at the time, by saying how ridiculous it was to admit this swerve in order to make the system work. That, of course, if you had this system of every object reducible to atoms, then the question comes, why is there entropy? Why is there change? Why is there transformation? And the only answer that people like Lucretius could come up with, of course, at the time, was that, there must be an element of randomness that we have to add into the system in order to make things change. Because otherwise you would have atoms that were equidistant in a kind of like lattice, falling infinitely through space, and you would have no change. You'd have no time, effectively. So today, the reason that Hitch and Dennett, etc., can rehabilitate people like Lucretius is because today they use quantum mechanics to introduce that same concept of randomness. And despite the fact that these Redditors will dismiss quantum woo, as they call it, quite rightly in some ways, like the Deepak Chopras of the world and the sort of New Age spiritualism that quantum mechanics tends to lend credence to, unfortunately. They are also in a way, victims of that same kind of woo. In that, like Lucretius, to hold this atomistic understanding that everything is reducible to these fundamental particles, that you have to admit that sense of randomness, which is not necessary to explain the phenomenon. Like, you can use something like Bohmian mechanics to predict a lot of the things that more relativistic or woo quantum mechanics theories could predict. So it's not necessary to accept all of the implications of the randomness of quantum mechanics. And even that randomness is a sort of misunderstanding. It's a sort of, it's still consistent with a deterministic view, ultimately. So the problem is that if you hold this atomistic reductionism, where you believe that the human object, social systems, therefore, the objects that constitute our reality can simply be reduced to fundamental particles, then what you are asserting is the existence of a smaller group of objects, right? So this is the real problem that those type of reductionists run into. There's all very well and good to say that a chair doesn't really exist, or using the classic example of the two tables, right? We have one table that's like an ideal concept and one table that's physical, and to say that there's no such thing as a table, there's no such thing as a chair, all of these things are reducible to atoms. But if you follow that reductionist path, you're not actually escaping objects, you're asserting objectivity, and you're asserting the ontology, fundamental ontology of the object, in a far more essential way, and in a far more mechanical way, and a far more complete way than even the metaphysically conservative, quote unquote, people. So, a metaphysically conservative person might say, okay, well, there's an ideal of a chair, and there's a form of a human, and there's a form of a tennis racket, or whatever, right? But what these sort of scientists are saying, and the reductionists, more so the eliminativists, people like Dennett, the Redditors, and the sort of obnoxious liberals that people like Bowden really despised, is what they're doing in a fundamental way is asserting the object, even in their attempt to destroy it. So in the obliteration of all of the everyday objects that structure our social life, which is, institutions as having some kind of like objective, absolute existence, the idea of the aesthetic object, of art having a kind of an ontology, like an objective ontology. Okay, maybe, as Harman would say, in order for art to have ontology, it needs to have a relation with a human. Okay, fine. But you can still assert art as an object. You can still assert institutions as having a kind of objectivity. And ultimately, you can assert that the human being is an object in its own right. And it's not just an impersonal system comprised of these mechanical, physical forces. But in the very rejection of all of that, they're actually asserting a deeper ontology and a deeper objectivity, where the universe is constructed out of atoms. And of course, they can't explain the ontology of the atom, because the whole project is to destroy objects. But in that pursuit of destruction, they actually end up having to construct the entire deconstruction on the assertion of these fundamental objects that they don't have a theory for. So a lot of what happens then when people get to that point, because you have to remember that even for Bowden, I don't think he was thinking in these terms. I'm trying to lay it out in terms of how I've read and studied Bowden and listened to him and read people of a similar ideal to him. And even when you consider people like Christopher Hitchens, he was notoriously, notoriously brash and crude and simplistic and quite anti-intellectual in the way that he addressed Christianity. That for him, he wasn't interested in the theology or the philosophy. That type of thing didn't interest him at all. He was very competent on matters of current affairs and of politics. I think Bowden's quite similar to Hitchens in that way, that they're both people that invested perhaps far too much time in the politics of the everyday and perhaps not enough in the actual philosophy. Like, when you listen to Bowden's speech on Heidegger, it's quite clear that he doesn't really understand Heidegger. And of course, he wouldn't, because he's not really the type of person that'd be interested in engaging with that. He's more interested in metapolitics, he's more interested in art, he's more interested in literature, and he's not really interested in reading Being and Time, devoting a huge amount of time to the study of Being and Time. So what do we end up with? Well, these people like the reductors that oppose all objectivity and oppose kind of ontology on the ontology. So the people that oppose the ontology of the everyday, when they start to clock the fact that, okay, what they're saying implies that there's this absolute, relation of objects at the base of reality, they reject that and accept a kind of what you would call today perhaps pantheism or dynamic monism. And this is where Bowden's materialism and his spirituality interconnect. So we've addressed the fact that, okay, on the one side, you've got the eliminativists and the sort of liberal, destructive view that all reality, social reality, can be deconstructed into constituent matter. And in fact, it's not simply that these ideas are contingent upon matter, that they're actually just simply, they can be eliminated and you can explain it simply in terms of matter. And that comes into the problem of having a reality constructed on fundamental objects. And on the other hand, you've got the metaphysical conservatives that argue that the world, the social reality, it has no dependency or reducibility or connection to the social and the possibility of the social, that these are objective realities that exist independent of man in a way. And Bowden rejected both of these views, both the eliminativism and the sort of naive metaphysical conservatism that particularly Christians have, and it's very off the shelf. It's very rigorous, it's elegant, there's a lot of theory behind it, there's a lot of time invested into it, and if you want to have that off the shelf metaphysical conservatism, you can. It's not, it's very easy to adopt that. But Bowden was never accepting of that, and I think that was the second channel of his rejection of Christianity. Not only its sort of maudlin, liberal self-flagellation and self-pity in a way, but also this philosophical current of that sort of stagnant, the kind of stagnant reality that kind of Christian philosophy implies. Whereas Bowden believed in the possibility of radical transformation, total upending, personal, psychological and sociological change in the matter of, weeks and months and years. That a whole society could be completely transformed overnight. I mean, you take something like the current collapse of Afghanistan. You have a 20-year period of this kind of conservatism, this idea of building these liberal institutions and the rule of law, and okay, there may be a corrupt government, but we can work with it in this nation building context. And then the Taliban overturns that within the space of weeks. And that's the kind of, what Bowden probably would have said about that is that what that demonstrates is that having a force of will and having an ideological conviction is worth a lot more than all of the technogoguery and all of the sort of material excesses and technological intrigues of the West. That, okay, you can have on one side a dispassionate drone operator who's flying around with his Xbox controller in his hand, right? And on the other hand, you can have a very small group of ill-equipped, ideologically secure people with a lot of conviction. And who's going to win out ultimately? For Bowden, he would always say that, the regime is going to shudder and collapse. That you get to a point, if there's no ideological belief, that this whole structure has to go down. And this is what he argued about the Soviet Union, is that in a way it wasn't the economic failings of the Soviet Union that made it go down. It was the lack of belief in it anymore. It was that the Soviet Union had become a society in which nobody believed in it. So when he says in his Frankfurt School New Left speech that Khrushchev is hated because not Khrushchev, although he did try to liberalize, Gorbachev is hated because he wouldn't protect the structure as it shuddered, that it had to all go down and crash around him, and the people in the country resented him for that. I think he would view the situation in Afghanistan in the same way, that you have a government of people that are simply not ideologically committed. And Bowden would have immediately laughed his head off at the fact that the Taliban had taken over the country in a week. And he would have been a bit annoyed as well at the fact that we'd invested so much money and wasted so many lives. So what do we get with Bowden in terms of this ontology? He's rejected eliminativism. He's rejected the naive conservatism. You get what he described as a Heraclitean view. And a Nietzschean view, although it actually isn't a Nietzschean view, it's really a kind of Heraclitean view. And what that view is what you would call a dynamic monism. And the idea is that where we talk about the elimination of objects of the everyday, social objects, human objects, into atoms, what a dynamic monist says, in opposition to an atomist, is that actually all of these objects of the everyday are reducible to a single substance, which is in flux. So it's not a typical form of monism where everything is constituted out of one substance and there is no change. The idea is that everything is reducible to a single substance, and the change and the flux of that substance generates the differentials that produce matter. And in a way, if you think about, how mass can be created from energy, and how 99% of the mass of the atom or whatever is just the extreme amounts of energy in the strong force or whatever. I mean, I'm not a physicist, but it's quite clear that the properties of mass are related to energy, and energetic transformations can create matter as we understand it. So the ontology of matter for an atomist is problematic in the sense that matter itself can be considered as a phenomenon of an energetic process. Now, whether energy is a substance and whether that substance has an ontology, like we're talking about are we talking about a substance or like a substrate, right? And for Bowden, I think he considered energy to be a substance, in that for Bowden, energy was, had an ontology. Okay, it was like the sea, right? And then all of the matter was the waves upon the sea. The transformations of the sea generated the matter. And he argues this in his Nietzsche speeches. He argues this, I think, his Evola speech, and almost perhaps in every single speech he's ever given. This idea that he's not a Christian because he believes in the transformation and the reintegration of all things. For him, life is when a son is born, when a son dies, when there's a supernova, when something gets sucked into a black hole, when someone dies, when someone is born, all of that is a transformation of energy. And for him, that is life. So even death is a kind of constituent of life, in that when you die, and I think this is a direct quote, he says, when you die, your life is like a bullet that goes through screens, you hit the last screen and you're dead. And all of that energy is dissipated into everything that's around you. So he does have a monistic view, but it is a dynamic monism, which is in contradiction with Christianity, of course. It's a view that leads to his inegalitarianism, because you might think, well, what does Bowden exactly mean when he uses terms like transcendence and that inequality creates differences that you can transcend? What does that really mean? What's he really talking about? If he doesn't have this traditionally metaphysically conservative view, what the fuck is he talking about? Well, the way that I can try to understand it is that if you are a dynamic monist and you believe that matter and so the objects of social life, of the everyday, are generated out of these energy differentials, then that inequality or that difference is so fundamental even to the possibility of life, right? That inequality, as he would describe, I would describe it as difference, because for it to be an inequality, you'd have to be evaluating that difference through a kind of judgment. But for him, that inequality is enough to say that all of the reality that is constituted, even the egalitarians, even the liberals, even the maudlin Christians that are telling him, oh yes, well, your mother has gone off to a better place and all this kind of thing. He mentions seeing his mother's cremation, right? And the box being put under this sort of collage of universalist spiritual symbols, like a peacock with many feathers, and this sort of weird perennialism that Christians are using to try and make themselves relevant again. And he wasn't interested in any of that at all sort of maudlin nonsense that was coming out of the priest's mouth, but he saw the fire, right? He saw the flames, run up the sides of the box and sort of move along every conceit in the actual structure of the box and consume the whole thing in flames, and then the door shuts down, right? And for him, that was a transcendent experience because, as I said, the idea is that there's that energy, there's that fire, and everything comes back into the world again. There's like a base level of energy, so to speak. Right, there's like a substrate, and the inequalities and the differences and the fluctuations within that generate the possibility of life. And so when there's a death, that is also balanced out by a life somewhere else, right? That for him, it's not kind of reincarnation idea, but the idea is that as you die, you live your life in an intense way, and all the energy that you put out into the world is destructive and constructive, and it's a form of life. And even then, your death, and even say the death of his mother, which again was a big part of why he rejected Christianity, was a form of kind of an affirmative event. It wasn't this promise of a future. It wasn't, oh well, your body may decompose and break down, but one day in 2,000 years or 200,000 years or whatever, there's going to be a resurrection and the body's going to be united with the spirit again and whatever. It's not that, kind of half believed promise. It's a reality of the present, that you die, you are a comet that breaks through the atmosphere, and you break up and explode into tiny little pieces and dissipate all that energy into the world, and then that's your life. You're a comet streaking through the sky, you die, all of your energy goes out into everything that exists, and the process starts again with something else. And that was his sort of theology, and that was his paganism. Obviously, he didn't believe in Odin and whatever, right? So, Bowden and Bowden's materialism, to sum up, I suppose, transcendence for Bowden is not something that emerges out of matter necessarily, but transcendence is the realization of matter, or the existence of matter. So, there's an energy differential at this fundamental substrate that he believes, structures the basis of all reality. And then from that inequality and that differential comes matter. It springs out of that differential. And that is the kind of transcendence, right? Like the very existence of these complex processes is the transcendence. And the self-realization, like the system analyzing itself, is that kind of overstepping, right? And so there isn't this contradiction, because some people might say, oh, well, Bowden's obviously a materialist, and yet he speaks about these objective realities and these objects as though, he's a metaphysical conservative. Well, he's not. He's not a limitivist. He's not a strict kind of Dennett-style materialist, a Redditor, and he's not a, sort of cringe metaphysical conservative. He has his own view, which is a kind of pantheistic view. And he can't even be an emergentist, and I don't think he's ever written, some people might say, oh, well, maybe he believes in emergence. And emergence is a kind of cop-out view where you believe that while everything is reducible to matter, there are certain emergent properties that are irreducible but nonetheless supervene upon matter. So the idea is that in, say, philosophy of mind, that mental states depend upon the existence of physical states, that you can't have a thought without a brain. But the thought isn't reducible simply to the interactions of, the constituents of the brain. The problem with that is some conservatives can go way, way overboard with it and take it on huge tangents that aren't justified. Bowden never did this. I'm thinking of people like Roger Scruton, and particularly his book, The Soul of the World, I believe. And in this, he makes an aesthetic argument for the ontology of art. Remember, we're going back to ontology now. Whereas someone like Graham Harman you kind of bring a Heideggerian view and say, okay, well, you can assert like the artwork as object, but the necessary kind of the factitude of the object is like the human interacting with the object, or the human presence in the object. Whereas what Scruton's arguing is that the object of the artwork is the emergent objectivity of the art from its constituent parts. So he'll give an example like, oh, well, the Rembrandt portrait is not simply reducible to the chemicals of the paint. And the face that we see in the Rembrandt portrait exists as an independent object. And that could be true. Okay, you can use emergentism to justify that. It still supervenes upon the chemicals, right? Like, if the chemicals weren't there, it wouldn't exist. Fine. But where he goes overboard is he tries to then connect this to philosophy of mind and then to the whole world. And he actually argues for this kind of weird pantheism, which Bowden would have completely despised, which was this idea that, okay, from the brain comes this emergent soul or this emergent mind, and then, this is Scruton's fatal error, the mind can then cause changes in the body. There's a downward causation. Whereas, of course, if the mind supervenes on the brain, then the mind can't cause changes in the brain, right? You can only get to a kind of epiphenomenalism. But then he extends it even further to say that if you consider the whole universe, you could consider there being an emergent soul or an emergent mind of the whole universe. Now, Bowden would have rejected all of this as complete nonsense, right? That you would have like an emergent God mind that's dictating the world to him. No, you have, the matter, and then below that you have the energy and the potentiality of all things, this chaos, this flux, this motion, this constant fire, this flame of transformation that underpins everything. And from that radical inequality of that energy springs forth all of the order and all of the materials of the world. And the human is the most complex and perfect, even in its imperfections, consequence of all of that chaos and all of that inequality. And it's not this organizing God mind that emerges from the chaos, but actually the organizing God mind is like us, right? You and me, we're the organizing God mind. And our social relations constitute that kind of social intelligence, which is why he sees these things as divine, because we don't have a divine spark or a divine flame in the way that, say, a metaphysical conservative would view, that we each are endowed with a soul. But Bowden believes that we do have a kind of flame only as a product of this energetic differential that ultimately will, for him would be considered effectively as infinite. So that is Bowden's view. I've tried to go over some on materialism, I think, and on his ontology. And I think that's important because Bowden can often be misconstructed, and even misconstructed on his own terms. I don't think his dynamic monism has anything to do with Nietzsche. It really doesn't. And Nietzsche doesn't particularly hold the view that Bowden does about these things. And certainly doesn't, I wouldn't say really holds the view of people like Heraclitus, although there is definitely a connection in many ways between the two thinkers, mainly in style, in their prose style and their philosophical style, rather than the content particularly. It's something like the eternal recurrence. It's one of those ideas of Nietzsche that can be very easily misunderstood and vulgarized into just, live every day as though you were going to have to live it over and over again. That's not what he meant by that. I mean, that's for another video. But the point is that, this view of Bowden, what I would call his dynamic monism, what you might call Bowden's spirituality, what you might call Bowden's materialism, I think is rooted in actually quite a sensible and quite mainstream view. But he, being Bowden, takes a radical and interesting perspective on this. And from that generates a lot of the views that may have, previous to this video, seemed inconsistent or confusing, but hopefully after listening to this, when you return to Bowden, things start to fall into place where you understand the context of where he's coming from. So, thanks for listening to this. I hope it's been informative and interesting, and good luck. Good listening to Bowden.